Okay, so welcome to you all. The first of our monthly sessions after our summer break. My name is David Bailey, and I'm one of the conveners of the Critical Political Economy Research Network of the European Sociological Association, which is the group that's hosting this event. We put on these monthly sessions to basically give us a chance to hear about new research being produced by members of the network and people who have been involved in our events and initiatives that we put on. We had a midterm workshop in Limerick, which is our most recent event. And we're very pleased to have this paper with Sarrah Kassem, who will be talking about her paper titled Labour Realities at Amazon and Covid-19, Obstacles and Collective Possibilities for its Warehouse Workers and M-Turk Workers. And we're also very pleased because this is one of the papers in the first launch issue of the journal Global Political Economy, with the co-editors-in-chief, both of whom are here today, Phoebe Moore and Monica Kluwer-Losada are both the co-editors of. And so we thought it'd be a nice opportunity because there's a strong overlap between the CPEN, the Critical Political Economy Research Network, and the journal, the Global Political Economy. So we thought it'd be nice to use this monthly space that we created as an opportunity to share new work as it's coming out. So we were very pleased that Sarrah agreed to speak with us. We've got the normal format that we're going for is that we have the author of the paper and then two commentators to speak about the paper, but also themes that the paper throws up for discussion for us in our work in critical political economy. So the first of those commentators will be Saori Shibata, who is also on the editorial board as an associate editor of the Global Political Economy. And Sarah is a lecturer in East Asian Studies at the University of Sheffield, and her research focuses on Japan's political economy, including the changing nature of work, the digital economy, and how Japan's model of capitalism is transforming. And our second commentator is Phoebe Moore, and Phoebe is Professor of Management and the Futures at Work at the University of Essex Business School and Senior Fellow at the ILO. And Phoebe's work is globally recognized and focusing on digitalization in the workplace, and her most recent book is The Quantified Self in Precarity, Work, Technology, and What Counts. So I'll just pass over to our speaker, Sarrah. Just to brief introduction, Sarrah is employed as a research associate and lecturer in political economy at the University of Tübingen, Germany, and after completing a dissertation on workers' alienation and agency in the platform economy, her general teaching and research focus on working conditions in the platform economy, labor organization, and intersectional dimensions of the labor movement. So we're very pleased to hear about your work, Sarrah. Thanks for speaking with us and giving us an opportunity to hear about the paper from you rather than only reading it, which obviously we enjoyed, but it's nice to hear people speak about their work as well. So thank you.
All right, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you also for the introduction and to everyone who has come here today. Yes, as David had said, this is part of my, let's say, larger research interest around the platform economy. So before really diving into the paper itself, I'd like to contextualize the work a bit. This has sort of developed or is a spin-off on my dissertation that I completed 2 years ago. And that was on work and alienation, the platform economy. Good news, it's being published, an edited version of it with Bristol University Press in around half a year. So the work is entitled Work and Alienation, the Platform Economy, Amazon, and the Power of Organization. So the interest in the platform economy really developed for me from the perspective of wanting to understand changes that are happening on the labor market, essentially, and capital and labor relations. Now, by taking a look at the platform economy, we see that it is very diverse in how it organizes its workers. So it helps to first contextualize or categorize the platforms. Now, one way to do so is essentially by differentiating between the nature of the platform and the nature of work itself. The nature of the platform I define as, or also adopting, of course, the work of other scholars, being location-based and web-based, and this is really the dimension that I feature in the article itself. meaning location-based here were the Amazon warehouse workers, so their labor is directly bound to being in the warehouse. And web-based is, for example, the Amazon Mechanical Turk worker who is behind the screen, laboring from home or a cafe or elsewhere. In terms of the nature of work, we can differentiate between ones who earn, let's say, a traditional time wage, being, for example, 12 euros the hour, regardless of how much output, let's call it, and gig workers, essentially, that are paid by the piece, which can also be by the hour or directly by a piece wage. So for this, I chose, in the article and the book itself, Amazon Mechanical Turk. So the idea is really to contrast two completely different platforms. And while in the article, the nature of the work kind of goes into the background, it's still there and informs the labor relations, of course. So for this article itself, I focus on the nature of the platform. And what I'm interested in is essentially seeing how does this nature of platform dialectically relate to how workers organize themselves, express their agency within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, in the larger book, I take a look at how workers are also alienated. So there's one side of the coin, which is how are workers alienated in the platform economy in relation to their platform organization. The other side is, okay, but how do workers organize themselves? So it's a very labor agency centered approach. Now, in this article, I adopt a historical materialist understanding of the world, understanding political, economic, social, technological conditions as dialectically related and constantly co-evolving, for which we should also, in this specific case, center the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, when we take a closer look at the different workforces of the platform economy, we can see that they express their agency in different ways. Now, in order to examine this, I contrast or take a closer look at the marketplace power and the workplace power. And in doing so, we can really see what kind of leverage do these workers have in order to express their agency. Now, the general picture is quite grim when it comes to these workforces, because both the Amazon warehouse workers and the MTurk workers have a rather low marketplace bargaining power, and that's because they're considered on the labor market to be low skilled. Now, this means that the Amazon warehouse worker essentially needs to work on the circulation line, meaning picking or packing items. So it's manual labor, but you do not need any further qualifications. And as such, you don't really have a high leverage on the labor market in order to, let's say, push for better working conditions per se, in comparison to, let's say, an engineer who works for Amazon Web Services. When it comes to the MTurk worker, you are one but many workers who labor via the internet to do online tasks. So you're part of this really outsourced global workforce, meaning also your leverage there is not so high because essentially you are completing human intelligence tasks. That's what they're called on MTurk, meaning basically you need to be able to differentiate between different colors, different emotions, digitalize things. So it's really, you're hired because you're a human. Now, when it comes to the workplace power, the realities are somewhat different, and that's because I would argue the nature of the platform plays such a crucial role here. The Amazon warehouse workers, in many cases, were already organizing prior to the pandemic, as in Germany, for example. Germany is actually a very interesting case because it is the largest market for Amazon outside of the US. It's in very close competition with the UK, so there's always this uncertainty of, is it the UK, is it Germany? And Germany is also the country where the first strike happened at an Amazon warehouse. Now, what happened in the COVID-19 pandemic is that it's precisely because workers are location-based, they were confronted with health and safety issues by working in a pandemic. Now, we saw the larger shift to online or e-commerce, and hence the demand increased, and Amazon was, again, weakening the marketplace power, looking for more workers. It essentially doubled its workforce just in the first 6 months of a pandemic. And they also increased or introduced the hazard pay. So you also have more workers to keep up with this demand. But this meant that workers were in a warehouse. There were cases, the cases were not communicated in a transparent manner to the other workers, and workers initially had no protective equipment. So they were at risk of contracting the virus. And we saw across the world then really that workers were framing their labor struggles vis-a-vis the COVID pandemic and contracting the virus. So we had cases both in Europe, or let's say in Europe as an example, where we see continuation of a labor struggle framed in different terms around the pandemic, but we also saw organized union drives in the US that we had not seen previously at Amazon warehouses, given also the union busting reputation, which is also the reality of Amazon. So in many ways, also workers in the US were starting to organize around the pandemic. We've seen the case of Christian Smalls being dismissed in Staten Island, who then went on to create Amazon Labor Union, which is now the first recognized union at a warehouse in the US, at an Amazon warehouse ever. And so we really see that here framing the labor struggle around the pandemic or vis-a-vis the pandemic has really strengthened the labor struggle per se. Now, when it comes to the MTurk workers, the reality is somewhat different. Here, the political economic conditions play a crucial role as well, of course, because these workers they don't labor in abstract to it's not a dichotomy between online virtual work and the rest of the world, but they're also located in their own political economic conditions of working through a pandemic. Here also the social conditions play a role because we know that the home is a place for unpaid reproductive labor, which has increased with the pandemic. So now if you're laboring anyways at home, you have to juggle, let's say, these responsibilities also, or the different forms of labor as well. Now we saw with the shift of online work also came a shift of more tasks, more or less on MTurk, or we can assume that the workforce has continued to grow. And this is not just because companies were outsourcing labor in an online manner on, for example, MTurk, or also because of universities, they were, conducting surveys. How is the pandemic affecting your labor, etc. But also we see gig workers who, for example, are delivery workers who realize, okay, in a pandemic, I would want to labor online on a platform rather than be a delivery worker, for instance. Now, when it comes here to understanding how labor organizes itself, I would say that, as many other scholars, we need to understand agency, not just in traditional terms through unions and traditional associations, let's say, but also through the kind of digital spaces that these workers instrumentalize on spaces like Turk Opticon or Reddit or 1 Hour Hit Stop in order to form solidarity. So on these forums, we see workers giving advice to one another, which requester, so a requester is someone that posts a task online, should I avoid because they don't pay or they will reject my task? Do you have advice on how to labor most efficiently? What is a good plugin? So there is a form and understanding of solidarity there as well. So this was happening before the pandemic and really, let's say, continued through the pandemic. So here we see that the nature of the platform itself does relate to the marketplace power and the workplace power. And in doing so, also how workers can frame or instrumentalize the political economic conditions in which they live to express their agency. Now, I hope by focusing on Amazon, which is, let's say, has a growing empire of its platforms, that we can see the implications of platforms in terms of their political, economic, their societal, and their technological power, as well as also the power they have in setting trends. Amazon is at the top of the list when it comes to setting trends on the labor market, may it be through algorithmic management or digital Taylorism. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed the article, and I'm very excited to see what kind of questions you have, and of course, what kind of discussion we will have. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much. Saori, we're going to pass over to you once you finish copying.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, there's some, yeah, so I'm sorry that I've been having a really bad cough, so hopefully that I can speak clearly. Thank you, Sarah. I really enjoyed reading your paper. I think you already kind of eloquently explained the paper so well, so I just only pick up a couple of points. I found it quite fascinating and interesting, and also kind of suggest further discussions with the participants today. So some of the things that, one of the things I found it interesting was that kind of drawing on Beverly Silver's understanding of marketplace, workplace, and respective bargaining power of workers. You kind of developed discussion of obviously gig workers and their potential capacity for bargaining by particularly paying attention specifically to how agency and structure power, how they evolve along with the kind of a much broader kind of material conditions. And I think this is sort of an interesting framework that we can think more about in future study of gig work. But also for further, I was thinking that whether we can kind of apply this kind of a way of thinking to the further studies of the workers in the digital era in more general. I'm not sure, but that can be something that we can think of as well. And also one of the key arguments that I think you developed was that, and then I found it particularly interesting, was that despite the fact that Amazon workers, warehouse workers experienced the kind of further weakening of their marketplace power, because of the pandemics and then the political economic conditions associated came with the pandemic, they experienced increased potential as well at the same time for their workplace power as a result of Amazon's growth. So I think that argument will also further kind of, you argue that while the growth of Amazon weakens the marketplace power of warehouse workers, it dialectically relates to their workplace power, since I think Amazon equally relies on the continued functioning of its circulation line in the warehouse to maintain and then grow a customer base. So there's this kind of certain kind of exploitation happens. At the same time, there's certain kind of emergence of potentialities there. And I think I really like that kind of way of looking at the gig workers there, I think. Also, I think as Amazon, that choice of Amazon is, I think it was just brilliant, I think, because I think we hear a lot about it, and we talk a lot about Amazon, particularly during the COVID time, because we saw historic kind of prominent rise of that platform companies, and then Amazon is the representative of such platform, emerging kind of a platform economies, I think. So I think this kind of case was like really fascinating. And also your take of a contrast between that warehouse-based physical workers versus the online workers, even though they were termed as gig workers equally, but they're very different in terms of their leverage vis-a-vis the capital, and their kind of what kind of bargaining power and potential they have is very different, and their challenges are different. So I think choosing the Amazon, but also choosing the physical warehouse workers as well as the online-based MTAG work gigas, I think that was a really interesting case here as well. And also I think I really like that you chose the kind of participant observation and a lot of kind of, interviews. I think it was really excellent, because I think that, as I said, we talk a lot about Amazon, but I think when it comes to actually what's actually going on at the work site, workplace, and then as well as at the marketplace, I think by kind of you just went into talk to people and the unions, actions, activities. I think that's like really kind of made this article, your study, really more special than other kind of only desk-based work that I think. So I think, have I got already 5 minutes past already, David?
Probably, but don't worry, you can just
one suggestion for discussion. So I really enjoyed the paper. The one thing probably that it's continuously coming up for people that who study gig economy, I think particularly online, like MTAG workers, that the gigas work is more and more fragmented tasks we'll probably continue to see, and then more and more potential for them to be more and more alienated as well. So as well as we see the potential for them, there's quite a heavy challenge there. And also one of the things I found, I studied the Japan's case as well, of the online gig workers. I think that people were kind of often led to believe that they have this opportunity for those workers that who didn't have that opportunity before in the marketplace. They were led to believe that they are now having this great opportunity that they couldn't used to make any money when, for instance, like housewives or elderly workers or people with disabilities. And then now this kind of new gig economy is like a great opportunity for workers. So when people were led to believe that, in that kind of situation, that how we can kind of think about the resistance is something that I thought it might be interesting to discuss with other people, and then of course with Sarah as well. Thank you. Yeah, I'll finish it here.
Excellent. Thank you, Saori. We'll go straight over to you, Phoebe.
Thank you very much. Cool. Yeah, no, it's really a great paper. So thank you so much for that, and for also sharing today, and for being part of the seminar. And it's really great to have you, and also for, of course, publishing in our first issue of Global Political Economy. We're really, really fortunate to have you here with us. So, and your paper, I think the significance, it's really an important intervention in the sense that you've captured a historical moment that I think is going to have a lot more resonance and significance as we go through the next sort of decades, to think in terms of political economy, and in terms of having the way that you've parceled it out based on Beverly Silver's way of doing that, looking at the marketplace and the workplace. I think we really need to do it, not least when we're looking at workers' power. So what I've been thinking about, and what really was a good springboard in terms of some of the stuff I've been already thinking about to do with who workers are. So I think what I did then is I kind of started to categorize, because if you think in terms of what happened with the economy during the pandemic, I think you can take it a little bit even further. And it is very true. If you look at the shares of Amazon, they're one of the only companies to actually really explode during that period. And you mentioned that in your paper. And I think it's interesting to do that when put into contrast with, of course, the experience of workers, because you have, as you've called them, so I talk a little bit about the kind of like online and offline work, because, and you're right to point that out, that you have more of the physicality of work in a warehouse and so on, or maybe the delivery drivers and the different people doing the different aspects of the supply chain. And also there's a value chain question, which I'll talk about in a second. But when you actually contrast the work that they're doing, one thing is that, you know, it's contributing to this one company really contrasted to other kind of what's happening with SMEs, what's happening with the local kind of cafes and shops, and of course these kinds of things. So when you then start to drill into thinking who are the workers creating this, creating the productivity for the company to thrive and to continue, is that they're not in Britain necessarily, even in the context, they're not even called essential workers. So what I started to think about is, who do we consider essential and key workers for the economy? So so what you had then are people who are, again, putting themselves in the bare face of, and like, as you point out in your paper, the ones most susceptible to contracting the virus, going out there, delivering things to people's homes, contact in the warehouse, experiencing contact with other people. And then you have on the flip side of that, people who are doing the offline, so they're in the offline context, but people who are doing work behind the screen. So there's a lot of different kinds of jobs that people do in that space. Some of them are quite skilled, some of them are very routine, some of them you know, are in fact, so linguists doing work, for example, to do training for AI, for the kinds of, and then of course you also have content moderators. You have different kinds of jobs within each of their own sets of categorizations, different forms of worker protection. So what I started to think about is how during this historical moment, this kind of so something really disruptive that we've all experienced, that there are lots of new kinds of questions we can begin to use to interrogate what then should be asked for. And that does link very closely then to thinking about what types of resistance have emerged and what people can start asking for and what did not happen. And we can use some of those really blunt and those really brutal, in some cases, examples coming out of, for example, the shaming of the not smart or articulate trade unionist, you know, this kind of, and scapegoating is something Amazon's very good at. So they're really good at trade union busting. I don't have to tell you. So I think what we have a really interesting moment now to talk about who should be understood as essential workers, given, again, their worth for the supposed continuation of an economy and for this company. And then jumping into the other ways of thinking it through. So if there are worker protections, what existed? So again, people getting into their cars, delivering, or in the warehouse did not have access to necessarily the PPE, as you say, but people working at home. So there are other things that were discussed even previous to the pandemic, which were absolutely not highlighted enough. And that has to do with, for example, what does happen when people are doing domestic, in a sense, in the domestic space. So there is a location for that work. It's just that there are even fewer regulations and fewer social protections and fewer case potentials for social dialogue and things that you've highlighted as well. So I think those are the difficulties. If we are going to start talking about that, we can then jump into the contemporary moment where we have the Great Resignation. So one of the things that we're finding is a lot of people who were working, let's say in the airports, doing baggage handling and so on, taxi driving, actually one of the things they decided to do was to take work from the platform. So that's something that's becoming clear now, as there's a little bit of research going on to find out where have workers gone in the Great Resignation. So the discovery is that doing gig work can in fact earn you as much money, supposedly, as working in very antisocial hours and doing other kinds of jobs. So that's one thing I think we can really contrast the way that essential workers have been defined and what they actually have contributed, and then what has happened in terms of social protections for that category, what has happened in the online kind of platform, offline platform, what kinds of worker protections exist, and the real disparity around that, given what the value of the labor is in terms of the bloating of that particular company contrasted with other companies during that period of time. And then finally, what I wanted to bring up, if you are to think then about next steps and further things that you can research, there, in terms of talking about the value chain, one thing to do with artificial intelligence, for example, if you're interested in thinking through what kinds of work is happening in that offline space or online space. So you can actually sign up to be a worker on Mechanical Turks pretty easily yourself. I don't know if you've ever done that for fun. I did. And so if you put yourself as a worker there, you can very quickly find out the kinds of work that people are bidding to take, right? So you actually look at the work that's made available, and then you basically say what your costs would be. And you of course do have, there's a reputation economy question. What kinds of gigs have you taken so far? But what's interesting about that actual work, and again, the nature of it's being protected or not aside, the fact of its actual, the value of the labor in and of itself is ridiculous and completely invisibilized and completely done in unregulated spaces. But in the end, if you think in terms of, if we are to talk about AI as a product, people are literally classifying, data labeling, and so on. And sometimes they're working from home, sometimes they're working in contact centers. These contact centers, by the way, also exist across the world. So there is a kind of, when you talk about the location for gig workers, and then you say that people are offline, I'm wondering whether you could think through that location-based identification, because actually there are different kinds of labor, different skills levels. There are, of course, this offshoring for specific bits of the value chain, as well as the supply chain. So those are things that occurred to me, and thank you very much for your talk. And that's really all I was going to say, to kind of maybe spin into to kind of encourage some more discussion around the different topics that your paper raises. Thanks a lot.
Excellent, thank you, Phoebe. Well, thanks to all three speakers. That's really given us a lot to think about already in what remains. We tend to only run for an hour, so we've got about 30 minutes to give us a chance to think through some of those ideas that have been shared and some of the findings that come through in the paper. And basically, I'll leave it open. People can indicate if they can find a way to get my attention, then you can get into the queue to speak next. Thies, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on kind of the notion of the key or essential worker, because that's kind of part of why I was quite interested in participating in this workshop, because I wrote my bachelor dissertation on kind of the moral economy of key work and how we kind of perceive some work as more essential than other work. And I find it quite interesting. To me, it's not quite clear to what degree essential key work is simply a term used for political convenience to ensure that certain workers could continue to work even as other rules were enforced for other workers. And I did not quite come to a conclusion there. One other thing I also want to pick up on is the kind of, to what degree this categorization of being key was an essential worker, and at least in public discourse being spoken of as having an essential role in the economy, to what degree will that have any lasting impact? Because I'm not sure to what degree it will have a lasting impact. But yeah, that was kind of, my point.
Great, thank you. I wonder if I can take the opportunity as well to ask some questions. I mean, I really liked the focus on thinking about, this idea of the dialectical approach, the way that you begin the paper thinking about like historical materialism and conceptualizing capitalism, and the way that sort of, well, not necessarily defeats, but forms of exploitation or intensification of exploitation will also be linked to new forms and new patterns of mobilization and resistance. I thought was really done really well, and I think I like the way you traced it through with both cases in the paper. I suppose, but in terms of my question, I wondered if we could think about, like, we have kind of capitalism when we zoom into the firm and what's going on within Amazon, and then I wondered, like, what happens when we zoom back out again once we've got that understanding of what's going on within the firm. So in other words, to what degree is Amazon shaped by the different forms of resistance that we see? I mean, does it just dismiss it and sort of, or does it need to absorb those forms of resistance in some way? And if so, how? And given the importance of Amazon to the contemporary capitalism, I wondered whether we can think about in what ways is capitalism being affected, if at all, by these types of the different sort of new forms of resistance that we saw during COVID, and that we see, given that Amazon arguably is a sort of new form of capitalist domination. So yeah, I guess when we zoom back out again, I was thinking, what do we think again? Like, how we conceptualize in the firm and capital, given the fact that we can see those insights into the patterns of resistance that we show so well. I did have another question, but I'll perhaps come back to that if you want, once you had a chance to comment. Anybody else want to make a contribution or question? Monica?
Hi, thank you. Let me just lower my hand. Well, again, congratulations, Sarah. It was a real pleasure to have your article featuring in the first issue, and it has actually been one of the articles that has attracted a lot of interest and a lot of reads and downloads. So it's really great. My question perhaps is a little bit, you mentioned in terms of the strikes on how they, Amazon Germany was one of the first ones to kind of develop strikes. And of course, I remember as we were finalizing the article, we had a huge wave of strikes in the US, and so you kind of added a little bit on that. I was wondering though, through your research, has there been a lot of communication or any communication between Amazon striking workers in different locations, and whether there has been, what kind of examples of solidarity or kind of international solidarity, as we've seen in many cases? I'm thinking perhaps, back in the 90s with the UPS strike, how it became successful, the UPS strike in the US, through action at Paris, Charles de Gaulle Airport, or things like that. So whether to what extent Amazon workers in different locations are becoming aware that they can gather strength by boycotting, sabotaging at another location of striking, and whether there are any examples of that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've had quite a lot of comment and discussion on your paper, Sarah. So if you want to take a chance to respond to any of the points that have been raised, then please do.
All right, thank you so much. Yes, I was of course very happy to be part of the first issue of Global Political Economy, and also because it has been my first academic publication, so the joy is multiplied, let's say. Now, in terms of the comments, the questions, the discussion, first off, thank you to Saori and Phoebe for both your encouragement as well as your interesting insights to think about further research, and not just, okay, what is the platform economy now, but also the implications for the future, and also how these sort of seep into the larger economy, right? And it's not just about platforms. This is what we try to say repeatedly. Yes, platforms are interesting for how they organize their workers, but also what are the larger implications? Now, in terms of the questions and points that were raised, I'd be very happy to comment on these. In terms of the point raised on essential workers, I think this is something that a lot of us are thinking through right now, right? Because this label of the essential worker has been mobilized within the pandemic, and perhaps the Amazon warehouse worker was not seen as the number one essential worker in comparison to, let's say, the healthcare system. However, we have seen how important this label has been also and instrumentalized by workers. I think one of the most important cases has been the case of France, where the workers went on strike and said, listen, France is only allowing essential deliveries right now. Why are people still ordering from Amazon non-essential items? And they took them to court over this. So I think there is something to say about the mobilizing power around the essential worker. And I think within the platform economy, who is labeled or who is part of this essential workforce also relates to how visible they are as workers to the wider society, right? So you're more likely perhaps to think of an Amazon warehouse worker or your delivery worker. So your delivery worker is no longer just DHL, right? But we have Amazon Flex in certain countries, so they can still be gig workers that are the essential workers. But what happens to someone like the MTurk worker, who maybe in the first instance you wouldn't regard as the essential worker, but as Phoebe has highlighted, plays a crucial role along with many other workers in terms of the whole value chain of how AI and AI tasks and how AI and machine learning algorithms are really developed over time. Now, in terms of the dialectical relation between exploitation and resistance, I'm very happy you picked up on this, David, because I think it's essential when we think through capitalism and we think through history. I share the perspective that, you know, if we just see history from above and what capital does, then we really just dismiss the agency we have in bringing about any sort of change. And I think also when it comes to Amazon, we see this dialectical relation. So of course, there's only so much you can mention in the article. So I do hope you're interested in the book that's coming out. But what we do see is it does affect the labor struggle, goes back and affects capital. So let's take the example, one example for the warehouse workers and one example for MTurk. In terms of the warehouse workers, so Amazon, basically what it's been doing is it's taken its, let's say, labor relations, how they're organized in the US, and they're trying to export it outside of the US. The situation is that it came to Europe, and again, having two of its largest markets outside of the US being in Europe, and it's confronted with industrial relations and labor rights that are perhaps, you know, very different than in the US. So if we take a look at the example of Germany, in the US, Amazon has the reputation of being a union buster and really trying to crush any labor attempts. When it comes to Germany, it couldn't crush this because that right is constitutionally enshrined. So workers have the right to unionize. Of course, Amazon tries to counter these efforts to organize, perhaps by giving them very short-term contracts, because it has been proven by other scholars such as Sabrina Picella that workers are more likely to unionize once they have a fixed contract, for instance. But they don't only have a right to unionize in Germany, but also to then form a works council. So what happened a few years back when Jeff Bezos was in Germany to receive an award, I think for social responsibility actually, in a rare interview, he said, more or less, if I can paraphrase, you know, we don't need unions, we're to have the works councils in the Amazon warehouses. So this led to a larger question of, yeah, but what about the actual, you know, labor landscape we have in Germany where workers do unionize? So here, although Amazon would want to crush unions, they cannot. So in a way, this then goes back and affects them. However, Amazon has this large or general position of, we do not negotiate with unions. So although it cannot, you know, just diminish unions altogether, it will not sit down and negotiate collective bargaining agreement as the workers have been fighting for in Germany for the last close to 10 years. So there's an ongoing labor struggle. But then through the works councils, for example, they've managed to push for decentralized break rooms. So we do see workers in their specific local, not even, I'm not going to say national, but local context where they're able to push back. Of course, this is within a rather, let's say, reformist perspective where, you know, we're not talking about, and this is something that's been very important to workers, I think, in MTurk and an Amazon warehouse, not about replacing Amazon per se, but it's about improving the conditions. When it comes to MTurk, I think two examples I would say where we see workers pushing back is that it's by workers essentially organizing online, that workers also in India have managed to receive their payment through payments on their bank accounts and not through Amazon certificates, like gift certificates, as workers elsewhere. So only workers in the US and India get their money directly transferred as money, essentially. So I think this is one example of how they were able to push back. I think another one is that, thank you, Phoebe, for mentioning on laboring online on MTurk. I've also done it, and done also those 1 cent tasks, basically, where you digitalize receipts, for example. And on the MTurk platform, what used to be the case is that, you know, from the perspective of labor, the requester can basically, after every task, you know, they approve or reject your task, and then you see your approval rating. Now, what happened over the years now, and I think just introduced recently, is that you can see also the approval or the payment task. No, wait, what would you call it? Basically, you can see what is the probability of the requester paying you the task. So in a way, you know, this panopticon, it doesn't just go in one direction now, but you also have the transparency for workers to know, let's say, who would I want to labor for? So I would say that the landscape is changing. It is dynamic, and workers do organize, and they can bring about change. Of course, here also, you know, we're not talking about, we haven't reached a stage of essentially regulating Amazon Mechanical Turk. So it's also within a certain landscape. Let's see what's going to happen also with the proposed directive by the European Commission on platform work, whether that's going to bring about change for these workers. Now, finally, to your question, Monica, I'm very happy you mentioned this, because I didn't have the chance either in this paper to expand a bit more on transnational organization, which is absolutely crucial to Amazon workers. You know, the way I've always sort of perceived it in these meetings is, you know, Amazon workers and workers, as is the case, are the ones who know best how to organize themselves. And workers have seen, or they do regard, we know that Amazon is a transnational corporation, right? So they're saying, okay, if it's transnational, then we need to organize transnationally. So the example of Germany is, Germany, the largest market again, but if workers, let's assume that workers are able to organize a national strike in all the warehouses, which is not necessarily the case. The point is that Amazon in Poland, now Amazon Poland exists, but before 2021, the warehouses there were for the German market. So what do you do there when the uneven geographies of Europe are instrumentalized by Amazon to also undercut strikes? So this is an example. So workers, actually, the first attempt was between German and Polish workers. They realized that they were being used as strike breakers. So they started to organize. And today we have 2 networks. We have one, let's say, that's more mainstream, that's organized by Uni Global Union. It's an alliance of Amazon workers that has really grown over the last years from just, let's say, a few countries in Europe to really expanding and understanding Amazon, not just as we need to organize the workers in Europe, but also Northern America, also South America, where, you know, the markets where Amazon is also not just expanding and growing, but where it is, you know, starting to establish itself, such as India, for example. And also it has begged the question of how do we organize not just transnationally within the Amazon platform, but even and ideally across different platforms. So if we know that Amazon Web Services is the place where workers have the highest leverage, and it's also an Amazon platform, how can we actually have these workers support one another in their labor struggle? The other network is Amazon Workers International, which is, let's say, the less mainstream, less traditional worker unions, and also they try to organize workers who may not be unionized, essentially, for whatever reasons, their precarious contracts and so forth. So there are 2 networks, just off the top of my head, I would say, that are organizing workers transnationally. However, it is incredibly difficult to really disrupt Amazon's circulation line, because Amazon is almost a few steps ahead. So this is the largest question for workers. It's, okay, how do we successfully organize ourselves transnationally? And how do we do this when countries have different laws, have different working contracts, have different degrees of precarity? So I think this is picking up. As Amazon grows, so too does the network of workers, and hopefully, you know, trying to navigate what are different strategies by which we can organize in this platform and corporation.
Thank you. Phoebe, and then Brian.
Oh, so another aspect of German labor law that I think you could find quite, so co-determination, which 17 member states, unless I've missed one, suddenly having it in the past year or so, have this. And so, as you'll know, what that means is for example, when there is some kind of change in working pace, which comes about by way of a technology, which is part of the framework for safety and health, then there needs to be a discussion with Works Council and negotiation and agreement. So actually Works Councils do play a role, and they're not sort of, I think sometimes people misunderstand that they're kind of, somehow there's a hierarchy between trade unions and Works Council. I think there's a purpose that's served depending on what the strength is of law around it, and also the people involved. So that's one thing. And the other thing, very, very much enjoyed your paper, and that's all I'm going to say. Like, this is just a fantastic discussion, and I'm going to give way for Brian to say some stuff. Thank you.
Thank you, Phoebe. Brian, do you want to?
Hi. Yeah. Hello, everyone. I just wanna say I came like around this workshop a little bit randomly, so I have to excuse that I didn't have the chance to read the paper, but I found the presentation very fascinating, and so I might risk to ask stupid questions, but I'll try anyway. So the first one would be like in terms of like so my understanding is that all these like big tech corporations anyway are trying constantly to sort of substitute labor with technology, right? I think like also Uber and other big tech names, their goal seems to me that like they want to achieve a sort of like labor force made of drones and stuff like that. And so my question is like whether if in your research this comes out in terms of like class struggle, if for example in the mind of workers this is something that like sort of like harm their sort of resistance to some extent, and if actual corporations do leverage a lot on this dimension. And the other one was so you said, for example, that Amazon even managed to geographically diversify in order to sort of bust unions and things like that. So what I wanted to ask, if like maybe it's more a political opinion, whether you think that like also from the consumer side and the policymaker, there's more that should be done in order to support labor. So I don't know, maybe mass boycottages campaign, or if you, what is your sense of like what actually governments should do if Amazon should be dismantled, if Amazon should be partially nationalized, if I mean, I don't know, maybe if, a more general question, if I can expand a little bit. And thank you very much.
Thank you. We're going to aim to finish at 6, so if anybody's got a question that they're considering asking, now's your chance, otherwise you won't get one. Okay, otherwise I think I'll just perhaps give each of the speakers a chance to respond to the discussion. Any final thoughts or comments that you want to make? We only have the sessions for an hour, so it's always a bit short, and we always leave it with more that we want to discuss afterwards. But I think that's a good thing. I mean, that's sort of the nature of academic research, that there's always more to do. But,
Can I bring something up? Or is that, Saori, do you want to say some more stuff? Saori? Or Saori?
No, it's fine. I'm fine. Thank you.
Is it okay if I quickly jump in and say a couple of things?
yeah, please.
Great, good stuff. Sarah, the reason I'll just let you know, one of the reasons I said the things during my slot was actually some work in the International Labour Organization. So there's actually a report that's about to come out around essential workers. And one of the things so I started thinking about quite quickly into the pandemic is really thinking, so how are these categorizations being depicted? Because of course there were certain kind of rights that one then was quickly able to obtain if one were working in a certain kind of category, which I found a little bit audacious given the severe and obvious lack of any kind of protections, or the kind of the entangled employment relationship, the ongoing kind of aggressive trade union busting in Britain and so on for a long time. So that was really interesting for me. So I started to think about it and then think through how that that interplay with the kind of health dimensions and people's very much livelihoods, and then of course the mental health question, and I think there just needs to be new questions that are asked around how states respond to crises, and then what kinds of supposed roles people are like quite immediately put into. and then what it looks like. So one of the things that happened in Britain is that people were also put on furlough. And when I read through the criteria for being put on furlough, there was no guarantee that someone would have their job at the end of it. So what you have are these already existing, very precarious roles with already existing lack of protections. For example, people then also having to work from home, which I think you can start to think through when talking about digitalization, gig work, and these kinds of categories that we've come up with. And you mentioned it right at the end of your talk, the platform work. I think we need to start thinking again and start creating new criteria, quite new labels, because what does it mean to be a gig worker? Does it mean a student who sometimes takes work from MTurks and then goes to study and then becomes a lawyer? Do you see what or is it this kind of its complicated status? So I think, and one of the reasons I say that is one of the comments I made around the Great Resignation. So people who are doing 1,000 jobs, so what kinds of protections then can be ascribed? For example, when you don't have protections, regular protections because of the location of your work, you're working at home, you have an increased exposure to domestic violence. If you're being required to work from home because of this new uptake of hybrid working environments, which actually companies are saying they want. So they are sending people into the home working environment. Obviously, my research looking at the monitoring and surveillance dimension, it's really interesting, new period to start to ask what kinds of questions we should be asking. Of course, not in terms of protections, which I keep banging on about. Also, what kinds of resistance are emerging. We could find maybe cross-pollination across the online, offline, location-based, online-based, and all these kinds of new categories, because what does it mean to work from home when you are doing high-skilled, low-skilled, and what kinds of coherence can we find for better forms of resistance? But anyway, we have there's a lot of new kinds of questions that need to be asked. And I want to go back to what you said, David, and also I really like your theorization. I really like the use of Beverly Silver, this kind of structural power dimension, and then taking from marketplace to workplace. And I think that is a really good leveraging power, because again, there's a possibility that one could say things like, for example, content moderators, also very, very important during the pandemic, because people also there was a high uptake of social media, right? So that was where we found social relationships. That's where people went for their dopamine hits that they were getting while walking around the streets or at parties or whatever people did. So you have that whole economy around the people who are suffering on one side of the screen and taking the very traumatic, constant, very sort of high quota systems, ticketing systems for watching violent imagery while the other person doesn't have to. So there's that kind of question. Also, what kind of labeling exists for the production of AI too. But those people also then couldn't necessarily work from home because of the security dimension of their terminals. So then what kind of question do you ask when people are then kicked out of the job market altogether, in a sense, then told they have to work from home, can't do the kind of work? So then what happens when that work is automated? So I know I'm asking very, very specific questions that came up during the pandemic, but that's why I loved your paper. There's so many new bits of research, I think, that are going to come out of that. I'm really in this space where we need to ask new questions, come up with new categories, and think through new possible formations for resistance, because I don't think our old categories are going to last us, and the pandemic has kind of thrown everything into possibility for disarray, but also rearrangement and solidarity and arrangement and assembly. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you. Sarrah, I think I'll give you the last 2 minutes to wrap us up.
Great. Thank you so much, David. Yes, I think, Phoebe, you raised so many important questions, and sort of these are the questions that we're thinking through, how we understood, how we perceived platforms and how they organize workers, within a specific context. And then comes the pandemic, and then we really see that these platforms are just, their power, their political, economic, societal power, and so forth, it has been exacerbated, and we need to study that. We need to study the different dimensions that you've mentioned, because we use the label, and I use the label of platform economy, but really it's so diverse that it's becoming increasingly also, it begs the question, how much can we generalize? And we need to also look at specific cases and so forth. So yeah, thank you for all those questions. I'm definitely, there's a lot of food for thought there. Gonna think through these. Just very quickly, as to the questions that were raised by Brian, I would say that the role of technology within platforms and also the gig economy, there is a role there to be said for how class struggle is, let's say, organized and expresses itself. On the one hand, what kind of technology is employed at the workplace, let's say algorithmic management and so forth, and how workers frame also their labor struggles around that, like who is my boss, etc. But also how technology is used to communicate and to organize oneself, and what does organization then look like when you are, your labor relations are mediated through an app, for instance. As to what do we do about Amazon, I think, this is a very big question. In terms of the consumers, usually I'm asked, okay, so are we supposed to boycott Amazon now? And this leaves me with the comment always, this is up to each person's individual choice of what to do, because there's workers that would say absolutely. I've asked them this question, they would say absolutely boycott Amazon, and others say, you know what, it's our source of living. I myself order from Amazon and I'm treated better as an Amazon customer than I am as an Amazon worker. I think in terms of what policymakers can do, this is becoming increasingly, also we can see it on the media from discussions about government subsidizing essentially Amazon to open up a warehouse somewhere, to open up a headquarters somewhere. There's been a report recently by Global Union where I think it's a massive number of how much money goes into subsidizing Amazon. I think also begs the question with, taxation in Amazon, because they're able to dodge these regulations. And then there's a larger question around working conditions and labor rights and so forth. Exactly. Now, that's pretty much my last word. I think I would just thank everyone for coming, and thank you again for all the comments and the great discussion and questions.
Thanks to you. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Saori, and thanks, Phoebe, for speaking. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. It's been a great discussion, thinking about
Thank you, David.
Work, how it relates to critical political economy, global political economy, and going from capitalism to the workplace in Amazon and then back out again. I really appreciate that. I'm thinking about not just about Amazon, but also platform work in general, how things are changing. So thanks so much to all three of you. Sorry it's been so short.
Thanks for being smart and articulate.
Yeah, we have a good discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.